figured that this episode may be a good time to sort of talk about religion in particular. We've sort of had this topic come up in various ways through other seminars and other streams, and we want to sort of take the moment to articulate what our sort of, or my religious view is, especially when I approach it in history. What religion is to me and how it factors into the historical understanding, and really why religion exists as sort of the category that it does, why it's been so instrumental and important in human history from really as early as we know. And we want to kind of develop this further and say there might be different gradations and granularity into the very concept of religion itself, and it might have manifested in various ways through different cultures and time periods and epochs with such great diversity that even just using the term religion as a general category may not fairly capture all of those nuances. So part of the examination will be seeing how this term has sort of changed and developed over time, and whether it's a proper salient category to assess the range of phenomenon that usually falls within its scope. So in the first place, it's important to state we're all familiar with religion in some sense. It's been at least a part of our life or something that we've encountered in some way. The question of whether there's a God or some sort of superior principle, it's necessarily going to ground so much of the rest of your worldview. And you can imagine that a lot of other people through history have likely asked themselves the same thing. Is there a God? Is this real? And maybe we can also envision that for many, the answer was almost so obvious that they never had to ask in the first place. Their conception of the world, their experience of it was already so differently conditioned that the very possibility of God not existing or some sort of superior principle was essentially inconceivable to them. For people, we ask now, is there a God? It's going to inform so much of our other worldview, but for so many, and likely our ancient ancestors too, you couldn't even pose the question coherently in the first place. The answer was so obvious. It was already, their experience was conditioned by it in some sense, and that's how they related to the world. It was so integral to both their individuality and their social and communal participation. It was always there. So they always saw or experienced it in some sense. There's always an interesting thing when historians view ancient Egypt, and we've been able to sort of translate their text, decipher some of what they've written, and through that we've been able to piece together some of the Egyptian worldview. At least we can infer what they're likely to believe. And one of the striking kind of realizations that I've read multiple times from different archaeologists, different historians, the Egyptians never made a separation between a sort of physical and supernatural domain. For them, those two domains were always completely enmeshed. To even categorize them separately wouldn't even arise. Like that practice wouldn't arise. It wouldn't mean anything. It wouldn't even be coherent within their own worldview. So their conception of the afterlife, of spirituality, of ritual practice, of divinity, it was just as sure and stable to them as a category as whether the Nile would flood or not. That physical reality of the river moving, which determines their practical agriculture and so on, that was included in the same category as the passage into the afterlife and what's required for that ritually to occur in a beneficial way to the individual who's taking the journey. They weren't separated out. It's not like they made the sort of distinction between, oh, this is what we're really doing, and here's a ritual relating to some invisible world, and maybe it's really there or not. No, it was all fused together in their conception. And that's always puzzling for Western academics or modern people generally who are very comfortable with that bifurcation. We either say there is no supernatural world, or if there is, it's something separate. It's something maybe on top of the physical world, but they don't really interconnect, or they're not enmeshed with each other, so much so to be one singular thing. For many in the past, maybe even asking the question, is there a God or not, wasn't even relevant. Their whole worldview, their whole almost phenomenology was structured already with the experience of something divine. And we could critique it and say maybe it was just a perceived experience. They weren't really engaged in anything, and they were mistaken and totally lost and superstitious and so on. But I think that premise becomes a little difficult to maintain when you're looking at the full scope of human history. if everybody is deceived and everything's fake and it's all a lie and they're not experiencing anything at all, well, who's maintaining the deception? Is it just the elites, just the priest caste or something who knows secretly that it's a lie, but they want to manipulate the masses? I feel like that's the sort of like popular understanding at some level. But I would ask the question then, if it is the elite who's maintaining this thorough, unbelievable deception through human history, again, across civilizations, why is it that we only have writing from the elite? And most of what we understand about religion comes from elite sources. It's the elite who were literate through most of human history, and they're the ones who wrote down their beliefs. Were they just doing that on purpose to write and amongst their inner circle for literature that couldn't even be circulated amongst the population that they were intending to deceive? Or is it more likely that they were sincere in this belief? They were sincere in this worldview. So if that's the case and they were sincere, it means there may be a depth or a certain reality to some of this religious phenomenon that maybe we can't see now. Maybe we're deceived in not considering it because we've adopted our own worldview frame, which already admits or presupposes a bifurcation between the natural and the supernatural that has conditioned our experience, and that we, therefore, are not capable of ascertaining a phenomenon that could be right in front of us, and other pre-modern people had no trouble accessing. So a long-winded point, a sort of general discussion, but I think there's something to be said about this fact. Religion has been essential and integral to human civilization, the human experience, since our inception. And it's been essential and integral in this very particular way, where it was so deeply rooted in the very conscious or experiential phenomenon of being human. It wasn't something placed upon or synthetically implanted. It emerged organically from our experience. And in fact, in most cases, it formed the linchpin of our experience. It's only perhaps recently, in the grand scale of things, that we've departed from this eminently, almost ubiquitous view of things.
What are some examples of religious practice in prehistory?
There's an interesting example in really prehistory. It's before written sources, and so well before even settled or established civilization. I'm going to forget the exact dates off the top of my head now because it's been a little while since I've looked into it. But one of the most famous archaeological discoveries of cave paintings in Europe, and I believe this one was in Spain, maybe France, I could be wrong, but it's a very famous example of extensive cave painting, just animals galore, using sophisticated paints for the time, processed to even produce them. And originally, it was thought that early human beings may have dwelt in caves and used caves as a habitation place, as shelter from the Ice Age or something to that effect. But this cave was very interesting because most of it was inaccessible. It wasn't easy to get into. It was intentionally built, this chamber filled with paintings, built very deep in the cave, not where you would go just for regular habitation. You had to go through these like channels and passageways basically that made it largely inaccessible. And the prevailing thought about it now is it was likely a sort of initiation site. It was a place where, with deep religious significance for the people who occupied it, where they would take maybe young boys to be initiated into a manhood cult or something of that sort, related to what the religious practices were, which were likely a type of animism based on all the animal paintings in the cave itself. The point is, the cave didn't serve a practical purpose. It wasn't utilitarian. It almost certainly, just based on the way it was constructed and where it was, something religious in nature, had some ritual practice.
Fast forward to the Ptolemaic period.
By then, you have what we would understand as like full-fledged classical paganism. So polytheism, multiple gods, especially city cults and city gods, ancestor gods. But the worldview is largely the same. This is the time of the ancient Greeks and Romans, which many are familiar with. People are generally familiar with that mythology. But it was still a similar sort of idea that even if you see a particular river, it's it embodies or typifies a particular river god. It might not even be a major one. It may be one just localized for that river. But it's that general worldview I'm sort of describing, where they didn't see this separation. The river, of course, had water and it was flowing, but it naturally had a god associated with it too. Why would that not be the case? How could those be separated? What do you mean? It flows on its own, entirely separate from that? Or do you mean the god isn't connected to the river in that sense? It isn't bound to it? And this ties into even the sort of word for religion that we've inherited in the English language, and it comes from the Latin religio. And the direct translation of that, to my understanding, is to bind. That's what it means. That's the literal definition in Latin that the Romans employed, to bind. Wow. So the question naturally becomes, what is bound, or what are you binding to? And, in this conception, you could see the river with its particular river god. They're bound together. They're inseparable in both ways. They need each other in some sense. The river manifests some aspect of the god that has to be manifested, and the river only exists because it is that manifestation of the particular god. What are you as a Roman citizen in this context? You're bound to the city. You're bound to the cult, to the worship of the emperor in the imperial period in some cases. You're bound to your ancestral gods in your own hearth, your own altar at home. You're bound to all of this. Paganism had this idea where everything that existed, whether it was a human being, the natural forces, were binded in some sense to a divine being, some sort of personified divine type, and that was the reality of it. You also saw, by the 300s, the different philosophical schools are becoming fully formed and influential. So philosophical Platonism is influential in this way too. A lot of pagan elites believed in almost a type of monotheism where they saw us, Platonism, by Plato, the philosopher Plato. Good question, just to clarify. But his ideas did become influential in some of those circles, where they would see one supreme principle that was the actual foundation that underlied all of reality, and the different gods that they worshipped in different capacities were so many different manifestations of that one singular principle. So they had this sort of conception, very hierarchical ontologically, where there's being itself, or the supreme being, or maybe even something higher, and it filters down and flows through the world on so many different degrees, and culminating in the physical, which is always related in this unbroken chain back to the principle, but yet everything still has its place and position. So you see ideas like that elaborated, which are actually very influential in Christian history and Islamic history later. This worldview, seeing the world as sort of bound essentially to something divine, it's part of why the Romans, for instance, or even pagans generally, were capable of understanding, interacting with, and assimilating other cultures' gods in some sense. They saw them, it's of course, this tribe and this people, of course they have their own gods. Naturally, that's just how the world works. We have our own gods too. We can include them in the cult. We can appropriate some of them and fuse them to our gods, and that understanding, we can even let them worship them in their own way. That's fine. It's not exclusionary in that way. They're sort of seeing things almost leveled. This is the divine. It's like encountering another tribe's gods that you would consider to be just as real to them as encountering the physical tribe itself. There's no separation, Of course, a tribe will come with its gods, and those gods are just as real as mine, because it's grounded in that same fundamental principle, this binding between the physical and the divine in some sense.
What came first? Monotheism or polytheism?
The general understanding of religious history is that all religions started as polytheistic in some sense, and then monotheism became a sort of later development, merged sometime in the future. There's almost this evolution of the idea, you could say. Polytheism represented something simple, primitive, and monotheism more rich, complex view of how divinity might work. But I'm not personally, and this would be my hot take on it, I'm not entirely convinced of that conception. I think it might actually be the other way around. I think the kind of philosophical conception of Plato, where there is some sort of supreme reality or principle that underlies all of the other particular manifestations of individual gods that would be considered in the polytheistic schema, I think that might be the original point of view. And true polytheism represents a sort of degeneration or degradation of that. And I think even a good example of this in history might be Hinduism, or what we call Hinduism. It seems like the Vedas and the Upanishads, some of this early literatures, does attest to a type of monotheistic conception that is comfortable with admitting a cult of so many different gods, which are really just a manifestation of a supreme principle. So, and you see it in even ancient history too. I think the city god of different tribes and different groups as they emerged in Mesopotamia, for instance, really was associated with the supreme principle, and all other gods are just additions or manifestations or adaptations of that idea in some sense. And each tribe or city saw their particular god as the central god. It was identified as such. Almost the same way in Hinduism, to my understanding, the different branches that put a greater emphasis on Shiva over Vishnu, and then vice versa, they both say that either Shiva is the supreme god or Vishnu is the supreme god, but they culminate in this understanding of what supreme godhood really is, and see the other one, the counterpart, as a manifestation in some sense. So there's always this tendency. I think if you are careful in examining the history, you can isolate this component of the worldview, which speaks to a type of, like, I don't know if monotheism is the perfect word for it, but it's like a root monotheism that is being sort of degraded and separated over time. And I think there's evidence of this even in Plato, when he sees the sort of Homeric conception of the gods, which is present in the Iliad, the Odyssey, and that is just the personified, anthropomorphized gods, multiple. There's no higher principle. Maybe Zeus is a bit stronger than the others, but that's it. It's not, he's stronger in power on the same level and not by being at a higher level. So Plato sort of critiques that view and sees it as a corruption or a degradation of an original viewpoint that was sensitive or understood this idea of, like, supreme being in some sense. So it's if you take Plato at face value, maybe you could dismiss it and say he was just engaged in some sort of cultural critique and wanted to present his viewpoint as restoring something original and pure and pristine. But I think there's enough indications generally where you could say maybe a type of monotheism is the root religious understanding, and the true anthropomorphized paganism or polytheism that comes later is a degradation of sorts.
Tell us more about Hinduism.
Ultimately, like, what I know has come from what I've read of the Upanishads, which was in a particular branch called Advaita Vedanta. It's related to the Vedas, the original texts, which form the corpus of later Hinduism. And, I'm not comfortable in saying that it's representative totally of Hinduism as such, like it represents the true or absolute Hinduism, because it is one school of thought, you could say, a very important one, and one that I think is metaphysically rich and interesting, but at the same time, I don't know if it represents the full scope. But in that conception, the general stuff I know, like, there is a sort of supreme being, which they would call Brahman. But the thing is, this supreme being is, to use the term even being in relation to it, is already mistaken. Its being is qualified. It's already determinate. It's already determining this thing, even if it's supreme, as this thing. It's particularized. It's individualized in that sense. And their conception of Brahman is even more transcendent. It's unqualified and unconditioned. And they believe, in this sense, Brahman is the infinite. The infinite, which quite literally can't be limited or contained or constrained or even delimited. And because it can't be contained or described in any way, there's no proper word which describes it. It doesn't actually capture the essence of what it is. But it is the supreme principle in its infinity and plenitude that almost I'm going to use the term emanate, which is not the proper term, but it emanates a qualified type of Brahman that is supreme being in some sense, or could be expressed in that way. We can at least describe it, and it's almost a qualified form of this infinity. But already by being qualified, it's lesser in some sense. So from there, and the terms I know, you have for the unqualified Brahman, it's Brahman Nirguna, and then for the qualified Brahman, Brahman Saguna, like it's Brahman unqualified and Brahman qualified. When it comes to the qualified Brahman, this is almost, again, the supreme being. It is the sort of principle of all subsequent beings, more or less, even though it owes its existence, if you want to call it to that, even though it didn't start to exist or begin to exist, it's the sort of qualified form of this eternal, absolute infinity. It begins the process of being. The Brahman qualified is unity in itself. It's unified, it's total being in this way. And it contains within itself the total possibilities of being as such. And by being in now, we mean the total possibilities of manifestation, everything that can exist and be in multiplicity. And the first step in this sort of progression then is for Brahman Saguna to almost bifurcate itself, to produce within itself a type of duality, two different elements, which is Purusha and Prakriti. And these become these sort of poles of manifestation. One extreme, one is like essence, one is substance. It's perhaps one way to look at it, even though the terms probably aren't adequate. And within that sort of unfolding of the poles of manifestation, you have the production or the manifestation of all possibilities of being in this way. And within all of those possibilities of being, there's so many different domains. It's hierarchical. Like, they're not all just equal. Some are closer, approximate to the higher pole, the one like the heavenly pole in this sense, Purusha, essence, and some are closer to the sort of substantive pole, Prakriti, which is it's not evil or malefic at all, but it's lower. It's multiplicity. It's closer to the side of multiplicity than the essences, which is closer to unity. So the sort of higher up on the scale, you have what could be called almost like the heavens or heavenly domains. And within that, then, you have a whole panoply of gods and spiritual beings that occupy those domains. And in this conception, the sort of main ones are called the Trimurti, which is Shiva, Vishnu, and Brahman, but a different Brahman. It's a third one almost in this conception. And they become like the main gods, more or less, in a certain way. They represent a direct manifestation of the spiritual light, which is called Buddhi. It's emanating straight from Brahma Ishvara, which is the qualified Brahma. And so it's this whole thing, like, you get into this, and these gods, they're in the world, but they owe their existence to some principle which is outside the world in this sense. And between them, and especially Vishnu, there's like this whole pole of manifestation that's between these two principles. They conceive of it almost as the upper and lower waters. There's two waters. It has to be split in the middle, basically. What's in the upper waters is what's formless and beyond individuality in a general sense, and what's below the waters is individual. It's formal. It's particularized in this way. And Vishnu is on the waters, dreaming like different worlds, basically, that are being created. But there's a sort of logic to the whole system. The worlds follow an established cyclical cycle. They also believe that even this whole production altogether, starting from the qualified Brahman, will expire through its own cycle eventually, and there'll have to be another one. So there's so many layers of cycles and everything else happening until you have basically our world, our what we call the physical world, and some of its non-physical components, and as they understand it, and only represents one infinitesimal part of this world schema. And there would be other worlds like it insofar as they're conditioned by form and individuality as well.
Where is our world in regards to Hinduism? What does Hindu practice look like?
That's a really good question, actually. Like, I'll answer the first. Where is our world? Yeah. It represents one of those possibilities of a formal, individualized world. Like, it's in the lower waters, so to speak.
Like that substance.
Yeah, it's closer to that. It's closer to that. Yeah, exactly. You got it. It's closer to the substantive side, you know, and this is the whole point in a certain sense. What does the practice look like? Well, it relates, there's so many rituals that you uphold. It's very ritualized, like that's a huge component, but it ties into something where I wanted to go with this discussion as well. What I've described with Vedanta, for instance, it represents another element of religion that's perhaps less understood in the West because it hasn't factored in very prominently in Christian history, I would say. And it's this conception of the ritual practice not simply being something you do externally. It's not just offering and votive sacrifice or anything of that, but this sort of idea of internal realization that's cultivated through a technique, through a consistent, dedicated spiritual practice and technique, which produces in the individual, first, in a general sense, the almost perfection of the human state itself, and then subsequently to that, realization of higher spiritual states. And it's something that is not totally conferred on the individual by a higher power. They're not sitting there as a passive receptacle waiting for it to happen, but it's something that one can really ascend to and engage in through practices in the world. So the conception of, like, this is very general again, but meditation even, and what that looks like, the various breathing exercises associated with it. That is an example of a type of spiritual technique, which in this context is supposed to sort of realize these higher states. In the Hindu conception, the advantage of doing all that outside of the regular ritual practice, they believe you can attain those states while still alive in this world. You don't have to die and go to heaven or something like that to really experience it or realize it integrally in your own being. So one can achieve even the highest realization while still living in that sense. So, and the more you do, they have this conception, and this is shared with Buddhism as well, of samsara, which is like this wheel of existence that you're circulating when you die. And the whole point is to escape it, more or less, you know, to get out, stop the movement, and really be unified, the superior principle. So if you fail to do that in your life, you might just keep circling the rounds, might be incarnated somewhere else in some other state or condition, and you'll almost do this endlessly until you finally achieve that realization that brings you out. So in some states, maybe you go up a little bit, you ascend the hierarchy a bit, and you're born into an even more beneficial spiritual state, and it makes the rest of the path easier. Like, maybe that's possible, but why risk it and wait? You want to take it as far as you can in this world, especially if you're capable of that internal realization. But they'll also say not everybody's capable of it. There's a real nature difference. It's hierarchical, and only some are over others. And this is where you see differences in the caste system and everything else like that. This idea of a sort of technique and practice that leads to realization in the self, it's very common in world history across Eastern civilizations. It's very prominent. And it existed in some way in the Roman pagan world and the Greek pagan worlds as well. We know less about that ultimately, but it had some sort of form. There has always been in these traditions, going back to ancient Egypt, or anytime we've had an established tradition related to a city or civilization, there's always been an element of the tradition that's been reserved for an elite, that's been sequestered off and separated from the general populace. Really a secret knowledge or practice that not everybody's allowed to partake in or know about. And it might have to be closely safeguarded by a particular class of people, or a caste even, like a priestly caste. It might be, take a different form. It's outside the priestly sacerdotal institution that existed within that particular civilization, and it's a group of other mystics or someone else. But there's always this sort of idea of esotericism, that there is something in the tradition, an understanding of the divine that not everybody can access. And it requires a type of spiritual discipline and technique, and very often the instruction of a master in order for one to attain it yourself. And you see that again in Egypt, in ancient Babylon. You see it in ancient Greece with the Eleusinian mysteries. You see it in Rome when those same sort of initiatic cults were maintained. You see it in early Christian history to some degree or another, a little less. You definitely see it in the Islamic world. You see it in Hinduism, less in terms of how it's categorically defined, but I would say it exists just almost in the whole structure of the tradition itself. Something like Taoism in China had these different esoteric degrees, and it was initiatic in many ways. So yeah, there's definitely a lot of this in world history. And what's the significance of that? And what does that mean? I think it's hard for people in the West or people from a Christian background especially to appreciate or understand that, because for much of Christian history, this idea of a sort of technique that brings you closer to God has never really been cultivated. You've had in Catholicism and Eastern Orthodoxy this conception of mystics and saints, but they usually take a more passive role. Like they engage in all of the regular practices of the tradition itself, but they do them very well. Like they're very dedicated, extremely dedicated, and they receive some sort of mystical vision or some experience. Whereas the sort of conception I'm describing, it's far more practical in that way. It involves a regimented technique and instruction, and there's almost a science to it. It's described as producing very specific results at so many stages. It's very schematized, and again, elite and exclusive, and not for everybody. So the general Christian idea has been the church or salvation, the teachings, the practices, everybody has to do them at the same level. Like this is how it's unfolded. This is, what's required. And that's not necessarily the form that it's taken in other traditions. Even within the Western sphere, and related people who have been there for a long time in Western Christendom, Jewish people, they maintain an esotericism in the form of Kabbalah. Like that is their sort of esoteric interpretation of the Jewish tradition. So it's a very common schema and theme, and there's interesting questions you can ask as to why it doesn't appear in the same pronounced way in Western Christendom as it did in all these other traditions around the world. And why is that the case? Is that something structural in Christianity itself? Do you need to have this sort of schema in order for the tradition to be true? Did Christianity ever have something like this? There's a lot of questions there. And what's even the importance? Like, what does that mean in the other traditions that they believe there's a sort of hidden dimension, a hidden layer to the tradition itself that's not experienceable, or not everybody can practice at the same level? It's hidden, it's restrictive, it's elite.
Let's go back. Give us more examples.
The Germanic pagans at the same time who will start coming to the world stage towards the fall of the Roman Empire, we know that they were polytheistic as well. That's well attested to. They had multiple cults to different deities who personified certain elements, certain characteristics, had a certain mythology associated with them, whatever it might be. They kind of matched that similar pagan or polytheistic pattern that we've described. But again, and this is that oscillation between the polytheism and monotheism, there's some indications, very scant, that there might have been amongst some of the bard class and their like priestly tellers, and that particular term for them is escaping me, of a teaching of a sort of like primordial deity that was more supreme than the later ones, and the later ones were just derivations or deities for an age of sorts, and they're going to be a deity for this age, and they have that power, but they derive from something else. And there's a lot. I've always found, and it's probably even just because of the shared Indo-European heritage, where it's that might be a segue there, but there's a lot of these myths or conceptions of a sort of primordial man who's divided up and used as the creation of the world. So it's very interesting. In Hinduism, there's a conception of that, of Mani, who's sort of divided up, and his parts, so to speak, form in so many different ways the different realities of the world, both physically and in a sort of subtle way as well, a different domain. In the Norse or Germanic mythology, it's a giant named Ymir who's divided up and carved up by the first beings, and his body parts become the sort of foundation of the world. And this is maybe it's not Indo-European derived, but in the ancient Egyptian tradition, there's of course the myth of Osiris, who's carved up and sacrificed and used as a sort of prima materia of creation in some sense. So yeah, it's just an interesting idea where this all comes from. There's these similar patterns or symbolic representations of what it is. In Kabbalah, the Jewish esoteric tradition, they have what's called Adam Kadmon, who's not even just physical Adam as we understand, but a sort of like primordial man in some way. And he's also divided up and scattered as part of creation. So when you're assessing these things, these myths, these practices, especially from the pagan past, we're really just like, we're trying to finish the jigsaw puzzle and we didn't have half the pieces. Like, you can't put it all together. There's maybe a good argument to be made that our understanding of it will always be hamstrung because of that. We're never going to get the full picture. And so what you're left with is a lot of peculiarities and weird anomalies. You're like, how is this happening? Or what's going on? Like one that I think of, and it's kind of bizarre, in Indo-European mythology as we know it, which extends back 5,000 years, most of it's not written down, and we only know it in the various pagan forms that it took in Europe and the Middle East in some capacities, and the influence it had on Hinduism as well. But in Hinduism, in Zoroastrianism, in Greek mythology, in Celtic mythology in some sense, in Slavic mythology, there's always this motif of like two twin brothers who are divine, and they're also associated with horses. They have like horses as their symbolism. And in all of these different cultures, like that story goes differently. The brothers mean something else. They have a different role. They perform different feats, whatever it might be. And you know, historians or archaeologists, they always associate this with like an original Indo-European myth that it likely derived from. And you can see that even through the language in some of these examples and the words for those brothers and how they relate etymologically. But an interesting example, there's no evidence of this practice or of this myth of the twin horse brothers existing in Germanic mythology in particular. There's no example of it, especially like the southern Germanics, not the Norse, but there's no evidence of it. It's never been attested to. But at the fall of the Roman Empire, when the Western Romans are pulling out of Britannia, what will later be England and the UK or whatnot, they pull out, and a group of Germanics start to move in, and they start to migrate there and start to settle, start to conquer, et cetera, et cetera. And this is the Anglo-Saxons. This is what we call them. It's a tribal confederation between Angles, Saxons, Jutes, some Frisians. And what's interesting, according to the stories that were written down, and we don't know if they're entirely historical because they were only written down 100 or 200 years later, but the leaders of this expedition were two brothers named Hengist and Horsa, which are just two different words for horse in Old English. It's two like twin brothers who are associated with horses, and they're leading the Anglo-Saxons on this migration into Britannia. Now, what's bizarre about this is like around 500 AD. This myth of the horse twin brothers, it exists in all of these other traditions that I just mentioned for thousands of years before that, or it's attested to thousands of years. And in that Germanic context, there was no attestation or any practice associated with the twin horse brothers. And all of a sudden, you have two twin brothers named Horse and Horse invading the British Isles and leading this expedition. And they were Norse pagans, or Germanic pagans in this way. They were associated with this Indo-European tradition. Why did it emerge in 500 AD and not earlier? in any practice. And according to the sources, when they were first written down, they considered those two brothers to be real people, real historical figures. And historians aren't sure that they really existed or they really were the figures, but the story goes like one died and another brother had to go avenge him, and it followed a lot of these like mythological motifs you see in the other stories. It's really bizarre. Like, how does that happen? Where does that come from? So I bring up that example because, like, we're playing with half the pieces, Maybe that teaching or that mythology was preserved in some way in the Germanic context, but secretly for a long time among a different class. And so it's not part of the public practices. It's not attested to anywhere else, and it just emerges for whatever reason in this context. Maybe it really did just come out of a vacuum. I don't know. But it is bizarre. How do we even account for that? Or where does that come from?
What does the oscillation between polytheism and monotheism tell us?
With what we can piece together, if it is going back and forth in some way, if that oscillation is possible and present in some capacity within these various traditions, it speaks to the deeper worldview as well. That at least for the people who saw things this way, they both had that enmeshed view of like the physical and the spiritual, as I earlier described, but at the same time, they had a very hierarchical view of reality. It was very much deployed through so many layers and dimensions, which probably interpenetrated at some level and were very much related to each other. But being itself, to be, was not just limited to a single physical domain. Never. It couldn't be. To even be physical, it had to include this whole hierarchy above it. So whether that hierarchy, you're worshiping the first layer, or there's all these manifestations of the different characteristics of the true divinity, but they're personified and they take on the form of this God with this name, like that's one layer and it's possible. And then you can maybe even worship above it or practice a realization or technique that takes you above it in your own spirit or understanding, whatever it might be, and you can ascend above that. I think the very possibility, the fact that there is that oscillation in the first place indicates that there's a shared ontological view between these different religious traditions. And it's the idea that the world isn't leveled down and squished to a single domain. They see a single domain, but from our perspective, that domain would be exceptionally deployed across so many different ontological degrees. Again, I think I said it well there, where to be, it's not to be at one level. It couldn't just be at one level. Being is so effulgent and expansive, it has to manifest across degrees dictated by different conditions. So in this condition, it's dictated by the physical. In other levels, well, it's a little less determined, so it has to be less physical. Perhaps it escapes all determination, or it becomes formless entirely, and that's another level. They always saw being as manifested in this capacity. Power didn't just exist as power univocally. There was divine power and human power. They were analogical, they meant the same thing, but their reality was different. And because to be couldn't just to be at one degree, power had to manifest in all of these different levels. It had to be wielded in an exceptional and higher sense, almost transcendent sense, by a being capable in its own conditions of wielding that power. So all of this is just a very I think that's an underlying or root worldview that's common to them, and definitely determine their mentality. And it's certainly a departure from our mentality, and really, maybe better said, our mentality is a departure from that. Mm-hmm. The modern mentality has been to sort of see that the world is mechanical and materialistic. And if there is something beyond, then it's almost detached. It's not really effective and present and continuous in the world itself. And when you're worshiping God, it's God, even if it's a monotheistic or supreme being, it's God is out there, and maybe even supreme being is too philosophical for the common conception, which might just see God as another guy up there, but just not in the world, and that's what matters. So there's definitely a departure from that understanding. And, the mechanistic materialist understanding has definitely led to real knowledge in its own domain. Like, we understand how matter works better than ever. But the question that would likely be posed by somebody upholding that older worldview, or somebody from the past who saw the system, they would not even view matter as important in the first place. They wouldn't see matter as the penultimate domain of understanding that you should divert all of your efforts to. They'd be like, okay, you figured out how this works, but I'm trying to ascend to the highest level. I'm trying to achieve like union with God, and I think I know how that's possible. I might even have the specific technique or practice that could take me there, and I'll show you the proof of that in my own way. If you want to come with me, I'll show you, you know?
It's like the Sufi masters that Paul you're talking
Exactly.
about. Well, I don't care.
That's a perfect illustration of the mentality. Like, they're like, I don't care at all. And that was very common. You saw a lot of that in the early Western colonialism or imperialism, even when Westerners went to India or China or the Middle East. They would want to show off the wonders of the scientific age. And a lot of people would just see it with like not even passing curiosity. They're like, okay, like what's the point though? Like, why would you focus everything into this? You know, there's something like, this is cool for a moment, but is it really worth the entirety of your mental efforts?
Will we go back?
Here's the thing. I actually don't think we will. I don't think it's possible at scale or on a civilizational level now, given how things are. I would maybe qualify that with it is maybe the smallest infinitesimal possibility that there could be a reorganization at the level required to achieve that worldview again. I think the worldview, and that's the thing, a lot of people even wouldn't want to. They wouldn't see the value in it in the first place. Now we'd be approaching it from the other angle of that original imperialist story. Like you could come with the sort of, you know, spiritual insights or something, and people are like, well, it's not, you know, what's the point? You know, it's not a computer. It's not this. You know, it's not I got my iPhone. Yeah, I got my iPhone. Whatever. Like none of that matters. So you have a different challenge in that regard, just on the popular level in terms of presentation. But that's also just because now the mentality isn't amenable to that sort of spiritual talk. And it's also because spirituality, or what it means or its practice, has already been so hollowed out in the West. Nobody knows. Like what we consider to be religion or what we associate with the religious point of view, it's usually monolithic because we've already moved so far into that one materialist bifurcation. So something that just presents something else or something other than the material, that's just all the same thing. It's just religion. There's no gradations, there's no granularity, that's it. And religion itself has become individualized to such a heavy degree. It's really become sentimentalized more than anything. Religion is good because it gives you emotional fulfillment or emotional stability. And a lot of people say religion is good because it gives you meaning. It gives you meaning in your life, and man, everything feels so meaningless now, so I just need meaning, so I'll go to church and this or that. All of this is taking religion and dragging it down to the individualized sentimental. You know, I won't even take it to the moral level where it's like, oh, I want to be religious because I think a rigorous discipline and spiritual practice will help me be a good person. It's not even that. Half the time, you know, it's not even motivated by that. Some people may yearn for the discipline, but they want to see what it returns to them, you know. The selfless effacement of the ego in the face of God is a conception lost in modern religiosity. And what that would even look like, or what those terms mean, or how one would achieve that in the first place. It's totally foreign. And this is what I just described there would be closer to the spiritual conceptions of the last 2 millennia than anything we see in religion now. What is religion about? The selfless effacement of the ego in the face of God. The approaching of God, the dissolution, the loss of yourself. But really through that loss, the transformation of yourself into its absolute reality. And what does that look like? What does that require of you? How does that manifest in your practice? Do you achieve that just by going to church on Sunday and having some sort of immediate meaning in your life? No, that's sentiment. It's different. So my whole point with all this, when we talk about religion or going back, in the first place, our mentality has been shaped so much, and as such, we're not even able to conceive what we're going back to. What we're talking about, what we're describing in religion is already something different. It's already been hollowed out and informed by the very conditions and processes that we might be trying to escape by going back. It's already been conditioned by that. And I think what you'll see on the opposite end is not people going back to true religious practice or something that approximates in its function the original religions and what that looked like in pre-modern times, I think you'll see a sort of non-materialism that is only pseudo-spirituality and is pseudo-religion. And it's a LARP, but it's also it's a LARP, but it's also something worse than that too, because it might be real in some sense. It might have elements or tinges of that non-physical experience that characterized some religious phenomenon or religious practice in the past. And because it has the element of the non-physical, people will see it as spiritual in the fullest sense possible, because it's just, oh, that was slightly non-physical, or I'm yearning for that. I'm yearning to move away from the meaninglessness of the world, of the physical. And maybe religion, like the traditional religions, I don't like those. I don't like institutions. I don't like the institutionalized formal religion. So let me just have it, let me be spiritual but not religious. Let me do psychedelics or engage in this practice and some little witchcraft stuff or whatever. Let me harmonize my crystals and achieve the perfect resonance, and it'll vibrate my spirit. Like, you're going to go for those types of experiences instead. It's people looking for something immaterial that presents itself outside the traditional schema, and that immaterial experience, whatever it is not true spirituality. It's something else altogether. The people in their traditional practices in the past were trying to ascend beyond the material. They're trying to transcend the limitations of this condition in one way or another. There was a true transcendence in place, and they really wanted to make sure they were going in that direction. That was very much a part of it. What I would describe these other sort of neo-spiritual practices as, they're moving towards the sub-material. It's like, I'm just trying to escape the material, this whatever it is, and I don't believe in God, but there's something out there, some energy or something like that. It's below the material. It's like the lower elements, You're not transcending anything. You're going below. In fact, you're almost dissolving. You're going into something else, like into a pure energy. Like, you see this all the time in people who describe these types of experiences too. There's all this talk about the collective mind, the collective consciousness, and a lot of this talk, we're all one, and we're all one in this. And it's like, they'll say this is the deep spirituality. And some of these people will also read non-dualist thinkers from the past, and they're saying the same thing. This is what Nagarjuna was saying. This is what Ibn Arabi was saying. This is all the sages of the past. And it's like, no, they weren't. You haven't read them. You didn't understand them. They're not talking about like melting your mind into some sort of collective consciousness. They're talking about reintegrating the ego, which feels like an annihilation. It takes the form of annihilation into God, into the supreme principle. It's not this collective human mind or human experience, the shared energy on the world. That's none of it. It's going well beyond that. In fact, the way that type of experience is described by Sufis, by other esotericists, other traditions, by Taoists, by all sorts, that idea of the collective mind or this general diffusion into the energy of the world, that's like the lowest stage. That's the last thing you want. It's not even just the transformation of the ego, it's the loss and destruction of the ego in the lowest sense, to where it can't be reconstituted or rectified. It'd be like, and I'm borrowing this example from someone, but it'd be like if you see the spiritual path as you're taking a boat and you're crossing a dangerous river and you have to get to the other riverbank. You have a whole group of people who are insistent on throwing themselves overboard and drowning. Like they see that as the real experience. Like, we don't want to get to the riverbank. We just want to be part of the flow of the energy of things, and chuck me overboard and drown them, trying to bring them back because it's dangerous, precarious waters, and they won't go. They're insistent on drowning. And I haven't substantiated a lot of this with the evidence or describing it, but this is the way I see it, and this is how I think it was seen in relation to real traditional spirituality. This type of, like, you just take a substance, you just imbibe the drug, and you've understood, you've unlocked enlightenment because you had in your own mind this belief that you achieved a union with the collective consciousness. It means nothing at all. It's not what you think it is, at least. In the worst case, I think it might be real in that way, but it is submaterial, and it's not good in that case. It represents a real danger. It's not something to be trifled with, more or less. So there's two different ways you can look at it. Regardless, in the individual level, none of it's real. It's just an indulgence in the ego, more or less.
What do you think about we are all one?
In the sort of traditional sense that I'm describing in those, in the perspective of various religions and the traditions and so on, there's a sense where you could say we're all one, but it's not the sense that it's typically taken to mean now. It's radically different, in fact. So, and it wouldn't be the first, it wouldn't be the first step in any of those processes either. It wouldn't be their starting point. We're all one, man. It's all the same. So don't do this or don't do, no, it's never going that way, you know? The way you say it's all one, it's like, it's really that the divinity is all one. And anything, and there's really maybe nothing besides the divinity, and everything else is only a sort of limited participation in that or expression of that. But it's not we're all one because we're all humans and we're like in this like a common experience of human nature. Like we're not all one just because we're one with the world and we're all a part of it. It's the conception of we're all one that is traditional, is transcendent. It's beyond all of that. If you were to take it in that hierarchical view, it'd be not even just so many steps up the hierarchy, but like infinite steps up the hierarchy, the way it'd be conceived. It'd be so, it's so divergent. In fact, there's probably no term of comparison. It'd be that divergent. So, yeah, it's just, we've all developed that conception. And if these different humans, these different traditions, as I've described them in their multiplicity, have come to some sort of shared worldview, it might be possible to say that there is some reality to that worldview. There's some experience they're having that was shared in common, and they interpreted it differently, described it differently, articulated it differently, and it manifested in different traditions and practices. But there might be a shared human experience of that. And depending on the framework, if you're willing to be religious or admit the metaphysical, you'd say then it's really metaphysical. From the pure secular historical point of view, you'd have to maybe explain this phenomenon in relation to just human nature as it is physically. And a lot of anthropologists do this. It's one of the definitions they use of human beings is to be religious, because it's just such a ubiquitous phenomenon. But it's, of course, they root it in evolutionary history or something to that effect. But so there's different frameworks you can take to understand it, but it's definitely common. What's interesting to me, and would be a slight argument against the pure evolutionary point of view, is the how common the religious understandings are despite cultural and geographical separation. There's a lot of similar symbols, motifs, metaphysics when you get to the core of it, so similar that it seems to defy just this sort of like root evolutionary explanation. Like why, unless you're going to have to just go and say all of our brain patterns are completely determined in this way, and we can only think along this sort of predefined structure that has taken this form. I don't know. It'd be a more difficult case to make.
Can you make a case for God using the similarities in religions throughout history?
I don't think it's like a bad view per se. I think it's largely true, but there's some who are definitely dedicated to their particular religious understanding, and they see their religion as exclusionary to all others. So they see their religion as the single manifestation of divine truth in human history, and nobody else has even come close. They're all making it up, or they're superstitious, and it's just this particular religion. I know a lot of Catholics who think this way personally, just as an anecdote. And I don't mean to single them out as like a negative example, but that's a very common view, especially amongst the resurgent, like traditional Catholics, which you're seeing more of. There's this view, no, it's all fake and false. So there's no truth in any of these other religions or practices. But I think it makes sense, and this is actually, funnily enough, the view articulated by the Vatican to give the Catholic example, but it makes sense that God, if he exists, he would be infinite in this way, and his deployment and connection and relationship to the world would be similarly infinite. It permeates and would underlie all things in some way. And through your connection to that, through your understanding, you may be able to see the simplest feature of nature and have something of God in that, and come to some understanding of God. You might be able to articulate and develop around that, but it would speak to that underlying reality. And that's actually like the Vatican's point of view. They say that all these other religions have had almost like shards of the truth here or there, understood through natural revelation, just seeing the world, having like that inbuilt human understanding. But it's of course the Catholic Church that represents that truth in its fullness. But you have others like outside of the almost regular religious schema, like perennialists of different sorts, who see that they claim that all religions are true, absolutely, and they do just diverge in expression and not in content. So again, it's just a whole range of views. If you adopt the atheist framework, then of course none of them are true, and you have to explain religions and these patterns along sociological or biological lines, and that's it. I don't try and force the view on the audience or anything, or try and make the case like you should believe this. I try and present them and their implications as generally as possible. But sometimes, in this case, I've probably been speaking more from a sort of perennialist view, where there's some truth in all these religions, and it's interesting to take that and assume that framework and then flesh it out a little bit.
God.
When you see something, you see, like I see you guys, or you guys see me here. How do you know that you're seeing me as I actually exist?
Right.
Because no matter what, as you're seeing me, that sense perception, it is being filtered through a whole apparatus in your mind. And he doesn't even make it purely physical. He doesn't say it's just the brain. In fact, what he thinks is being constructed is way more extensive than a lot of you. He thinks even space and time are conditions in the mind and not actually in reality as such. But yeah, in a sense. Yeah. But there is something out there. There's something happening, but we can never know it. We can never know that what we're accessing through the unity of our senses is really corresponding to things as they are in themselves extramentally. So as they exist, like we think of an object, like I think of the camera extramentally. What does it mean to be a camera in real life? Outside of my mind or my senses observing it. I might think I'm picturing something, what a camera is. I can never know what a camera is outside of my mind, because I need all of my mind and all of the apparatuses and conditions and faculties associated with it to have any experience of the camera whatsoever. There's no way to extra independently verify that there is such a thing as a camera in extramental reality in itself, as a thing in itself. Yes?
Can you relate that to the importance of language and how the word camera, the word camera,
it's all constructed.
Without that,
yep.
There's no...
You couldn't even signify it. And that's and Kant mentions language in his exposition. This is taken on later by like Wittgenstein, a later Wittgenstein, and like how words are really, like they don't correspond to reality in some definite sense. Where I'm taking this, and I even mentioned Kant in the first place, even if we admit all the Kantian, the most radical skepticism you could possibly imagine, not only do I say there's no supernatural world, I can even say that there's no physical world. I can be such a thorough skeptic like David Hume, who says that because all knowledge is empirical and there's no, like everything else outside of immediate empirical sense observation is just a logical inference which can't be grounded in the empiricism itself, he will bite the bullet in his skepticism and say you can't know that the sun will rise tomorrow. He takes empiricism in the most rigorous sense to its conclusion, and absolute skepticism. My claim, and this is where the argument comes from, even if you take that, even if you deny physical reality or the possibility to know anything in physical reality or the possibility to know anything in itself, your position and your thoughts require a pre-existing framework of intelligibility that is predicated on unity. Even as they exist in whatever capacity that they do within your own cognitive apparatus, those thoughts are unitive. Those perceptions are unitive. There is some underlying unitive reality there that renders them intelligible, at least to you, even if they don't lead to any extra mental knowledge or a knowledge of things in themselves. There is a prior, inescapable precondition of unity grounded in the thing. And it can't exist or come about because of the thought, or it can't be the thought creating it. And it can't be an illusion because of the thought. Because if it was produced by the thought, then the thought couldn't have existed as a unitive thought in the first place to do the production. It couldn't have the unitive existence as a thought that produces. It could never be unitive unless that unity pre-existed the thought itself. So this unity can't just be mental. It can't be a result, even an illusion of the thoughts themselves, because if they weren't unitive, they would not be. They couldn't be anything. And from there, you can say, well, where does this unitive intelligibility come from? Even if I can't know anything else in the world, physically, extra-physically, whatever framework you want to say, if I can't know anything with certainty, I can at least know that there's unity. And this unity this unitive principle must exist outside my mind. It must exist even before as a necessary precondition to ground intelligibility itself and any possible subsequent knowledge. And if that's the case, where else could this unity be grounded? It is even just unity itself. And if you have a thing that is extramental and unity itself, you have philosophically God in some sense. There is a being or something that is unitive in itself or is unity itself, which serves as the necessary precondition for all types of unity. It is the very thing that enables unity to be, because it is purely unitive. And if that's the ground for any possible thought, in a certain way you escape even Kantian or Humean skepticism. There has to be a thing. And you don't even have to start looking into the world and trying to parse out whether there's a supernatural or a natural. You don't even have to get there. This is something beyond. It's a type of ontological argument, more or less. But it's the fact that all intelligibility has to be grounded in this unity. For a thing to be intelligible at all, it has to be unitive. And even if we say our thoughts are intelligible to ourselves in some way, even without them corresponding to reality and being true in that sense, it doesn't matter. They're still unitive. And where does that unity come from?